Good evening. My name is Bernadette Glover, pastor of St. Paul Baptist Church in Montclair, New Jersey. Thank you for joining us for Reparations and Liberating the Soul of Society. Almost 100 years ago, in Southern California, beachfront property went underwater. Eminent domain ground the rights of the Black-owned property. But something happened recently there in Southern California. A reparations law was signed. And with that reparation law being signed, rightful ownership was restored. And the property that had been taken by eminent domain is now in the hands of the descendants of the original Black owners. Isn't that something? It's amazing how God's word still comes to pass. Like the word in Romans chapter 12, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It's a good thing to overcome evil with good and to pay what you owe. O-W-E, overcome wrong with equity. Tonight, let's lean in and listen to our panel. Moderator, Reverend Dr. Marcia Brown Woodard. Panelist, Reverend Dr. Campbell Singleton III. Reverend Dr. Terry Smith. Reverend Kenan Thomas, Reverend Dr. H. Dean Trulier will lead us further in reparations and liberating the soul of society.
Welcome to Village Talk. And today we're going to be focusing on reparations and liberating the soul of society. We're grateful for the leadership of Dr. Glover and for this panel who is with us today. And we're going to begin by asking the panel to just share who they are and a little bit about them so that our listening audience can begin to feel at home. Let's start with Dr. Smith.
Oh, good afternoon. I am Dr. Terry Ann Smith, and I currently serve as the Associate Dean of Institutional Assessment and Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at New Brunswick Theological Seminary. I am an ordained minister in the Baptist tradition. I am a writer, teacher, and when I think about my teaching, my ultimate goal for teaching in terms of pedagogy is to create an educational environment that encourages diversity of thought and critical reflection. It's an environment where students, I'm thinking, not only gain an understanding of the materials that they study, but also where they can appreciate the significance of listening to those who may not hold views that are similar to their own. And I will leave it with that.
Thank you. And Dr. Singleton.
Hello, my name is Campbell Singleton. I am currently serving as the senior pastor of the Union Baptist Church in Montclair, New Jersey, where I've been since January 2013. Also serve as the Associate Executive Minister of American Baptist Churches, where I've been since I graduated from Union Theological Seminary in 1994. And grateful for the opportunities that I have serving in both capacities to do a wide variety of social justice ministries. And very excited about joining these distinguished panelists to have a conversation about reparations. Thank you for your invitation.
And Reverend Thomas.
Happy Thursday, everyone. My name is Reverend Kenan Thomas. I am a minister on staff at Albert Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, formerly preacher on staff at First Baptist Church in Lincoln Gardens in Somerset, New Jersey. I'm a graduate of Drew Theological School, whose academic interests there were ethics, which allowed me to pursue DMin studies in hip hop culture, gospel, and transformation. That is what I hope to add to the discussion. And so thankful for Dr. Glover, because I assure you, I am the least of these, as the Apostle Paul would say.
And definitely not. And let's hear from Dr. Trulier.
Good morning, Dr. Woodard. It's good to see you. Great to reconnect with the panelists. My name is Harold Dean Trulier. I am Associate Professor of Applied Theology at Howard University School of Divinity and a member of Shiloh Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia, which is very difficult to see because of the shadow cast by Alfred Street. My pastor is Dr. Taft Quincy Heatley, and very, very happy to be a member of his congregation. I also direct a national research and demonstration project called Healing Communities USA, where we train congregations to engage the criminal justice system, care for families of the incarcerated, care for the incarcerated, and facilitating reentry, as well as developing advocacy ministries for criminal justice reform. I'm grateful to Dr. Glover for this invitation. Go back at least 3 months, somewhere between 3 months and 40 years. Anytime she calls, I try to be there because I know that she's one of those rare folks that does not believe that scholarship and worship are two ships passing in the night.
We are, I am excited about the opportunity for this conversation. I realize that I asked each of you to introduce yourselves, and I did not do that myself. I'm Marcia Brown Woodard and serve at Palmer Seminary and teach there. Also, I'm on ministerial staff at a congregation in Bryn Mawr Saints Memorial Baptist Church, and actually hold ministerial standing both in National Baptist, American Baptist Life, but also with Christian Church Disciples of Christ. So one of the things about me is that I do believe that it is the body of Christ and ways in which we can go across lines that often divide. I really like that. So while Palmer is where I hang out, I also had a chance to do some adjuncting at United Lutheran and even at Miss Theo, it used to be Biblical. So it's exciting for me that we're doing this work because one of the images for me, for the church, is that the church is a becoming place, a becoming center. And it's a place where hard questions can be asked, even when we don't have answers for them. And so our conversation today is one of those hard questions. We won't answer it all, but we'll be able to add to the conversation. So we have this phrase about reparations and liberating the soul of society. As you heard that and as you've been reflecting on it, just what are your first thoughts as you think about what's needed to liberate the soul of society? And for our conversation, why don't you just jump in as you are feeling led. If we have a lull, I'll call on somebody, but as long as we're conversing, we're going to go with how the Spirit will lead us. So when you hear that phrase, liberating the soul of society, what triggers for you, and what hits you at a place of passion?
I'm gonna jump in and stop it. I see my bun coming in and out, so I'm gonna try to keep my head still. It's a disappearing bun, but when I think of when I remember having this conversation with Dr. Glover, and I do thank her for this opportunity. But when I think of liberating the soul of society, I really do focus on the soul. It's the words, the soul. We as a body of believers, we are in touch with this language around the soul. And so liberating the soul of society just really sort of raises different kinds of questions around the moral ambiguity that is present. And I want to say even ambivalence that is present in our society. It doesn't take rocket science to look at the last 12 years to see that something is definitely, it was broke before, but now it is something that is beyond recognition. And so if we're trying to liberate something in our society, I think we need to first deal with this ambivalence around the morality that seems to be slowly crumbling in society. So that's where I would want to start us off to think about in terms of the soul, the morality of the soul, and in our case, in our societies, the immorality of the soul. So I want to start there. And I toss that out for us to think about and converse about what that looks like now.
And my initial thoughts went to a sermon I once heard Reverend Dr. Alan Waller preach. He was preaching a sermon. He said he had to give a presentation once on the soul of an idea. He was talking about the inception of America, and to truly understand what was going on as America was drafting its foundational documents. But what America had already participated in as it was forming the United States is to be dumbfounded, to have the language of the Constitution and the language of the preamble and the language of the Declaration of Independence and the soul of the idea they were crafting and drafting in 1776, and to have the inhumane, barbaric, death-dealing, as Dr. Cornel West would say, brutality that they had already engaged in, is to have perhaps the greatest contradiction human life has ever seen. My mind immediately went to soul. We can agree that soul is mind, body, will. Then what is the soul of America? Dr. Martin Luther King's words struck home about the three ills of a society, this society in particular: racism, poverty, and war. And I just wrote down a quick note that perhaps the mind of America is select wealth, the body of America is staggered mobility, and the will of America is global domination at the expense of national scarcity. And so when you think about the soul of America, what makes up this place from its inception throughout the wars, throughout the centuries until now, perhaps even a fourth is needed, and that is the legality of America, that the constitutional crisis we now face with the last president and literally the Constitution being challenged like never before in some eyes. The soul is truly at stake, to say the least.
Say the least.
When I think of the soul of America. And those founding documents, I appreciate Brother Kenan's rehearsal, Alan Waller's going back to beginnings, right? What's the exception? What's in the DNA? And I read it as a soul that is dramatically self-deceived by power. And the biblical model, and I use this with my students at Howard, actually comes from the David Bathsheba narrative, which of course we normally translate that as David the adulterer, as opposed to David who abuses his power. And that's what today we would call rape. I mean, Bathsheba has no choice in this matter when the king says come. So abusing his power to get Bathsheba, rape her, have her husband killed, all of that. And then the narrator takes us to a conversation between David and Nathan. And Nathan holds up before David's face a very clear case study in abuse of power. And David cannot recognize himself in the case study. For me, that's the American paradigm. That's how you can have a set of documents that talk about freedom and a set of institutions that negate it. That's how you can have verbiage that says we are the land of the free and enslaved people. You know, that's how we can talk about opportunity for all and then recognize and then not recognize the opportunity or provide opportunity for all, right? So that it seems to me that we are conflicted in our DNA. We have institutionalized and made a cultural norm, a form of self-deception that enables us to make ridiculous claims like make America great again, right? Or that enables us to talk about the good old days, or enables us to engage in any forms of nostalgia that minimize the pain of days gone by. It's a fundamental self-deception. And you know, West talks about it, Cornel West has been in his very first book when he talked about exception, right? David for me is the biblical exceptionalist, has no idea how power has corrupted this sweet shepherd boy, right? So so I come at it in terms of self-deception, which is why, and I know we were asked to come and talk about reparations. I told Dr. Glover, I said, I have no faith that reparations will ever occur, because this nation has the capacity to deny its history and to participate in this perpetually self-deceptive narrative that virtually self-selects history according to how we can justify current power arrangements.
Thank you. Thank you.
When I think about the soul, I think of the heart of what a person represents. And fundamentally, as we have this conversation about reparations, it's this one thought that continues to dominate life in America, the belief that white lives matter more than Black and brown and Asian and indigenous lives, and how it's given rise to institutions and laws and structures and systems and practices that leverage power for one racial group while marginalizing and vilifying masses of non-white persons. And we have seen how this belief has continued to work through colonization and slavery, Jim Crow, exclusionary social practices, economically dislocating people. We see it at the borders with immigration and redlining and mass incarceration. And as long as this thought continues to be an intricate part of the soul of America, with economic gains, I'm not confident that reparations is going to happen as well. It has not been taken seriously, and it's been dismissed. And there's also a parallel with the conversation of racial theory being taught in classes. The reason why it's denied is because America doesn't want to come to terms with its cruelty toward Black and brown people. And so Dr. Trulier lifted up a text. I want to lift up a controversial text that connects with this concept of liberating the soul from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, where it specifically talks to husbands in the same way. Be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you the gracious life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. And I want to suggest that America's prayer life is hindered because of this belief that whites are superior to people of color. And as long as this history is denied and not engaged, and there's no confession, there's no apology, there's no repentance, there's no, to bring another biblical text in the Great Samaritan, there's no work to restore that's holistic, that our prayer life will continue to be hindered because we lack moral authority. We can't deal with the violence that is happening in other countries and deny our own. We can't get upset when people are bending a knee at the flag because of what it has represented, and then also wave the flag with all of its history of racial terror and violence. And so we need liberation from this belief of superiority and inferiority, so that our prayers won't be hindered and that we can be a more effective witness for the God that we serve.
It would seem to me that so we'll say America, right? We'll talk about this idea of the racial inequality that exists in America, and we know it exists in America. But I would think we would need to focus on where those power structures, where that power is held. And so when you look at how our government is set up, and that it is a few, so it's a few persons who are able to control, and I'm talking about if we're looking at the Senate, if we're looking at where few persons are able to control that narrative, with others who are not willing to speak to it. And I'm talking about white America, the ones who actually control it, and the few. And that's why I talk about ambivalent, because sometimes, when it is to their advantage, then our issues they surface, they gain a few wings. But overall, it has never been to our advantage, because the idea of power and losing power is always going to be, as long as they hold those seats, and as long as the ones who are also in control of the power aren't speaking to the power themselves, we'll be having these conversations with our grandchildren and their grandchildren. It's amazing to me that we can have two senators who claim to be Democrats hold up processes. It's amazing that they call themselves that, and yet here it is, they have an opportunity to make some substantial change. And that's not happening, because power particularly white power, will trump everything else when it comes to the politics, and who's able to speak the narrative, who's able to control the narrative about what happens to non-white persons in America.
We have a required class at Howard School of Divinity called the Church Justice Advocacy. And we viewed a video interview with Marshall Gans at Harvard University. Right? And one of the things we talked about in this presentation that we watched on Tuesday very much paralleled what Dr. Smith is saying, in that we don't function in a true democracy, right? The founding fathers were afraid of real democracy. And so they created institutions that limited popular input and kept control of government and control of the nation in the hands of relatively few people. You know, and so that really has not changed. In fact, one of the things, Gans was one of the organizers of the Obama campaign in 2008. And one of the things that Gans pointed out was that we lost sight of the fact that politicians are only moved to change when they're pressured. When we elected a president and then expected him to fix everything. And so, you know, we did not apply the kind of ongoing pressure that we normally did in political settings once we, quote unquote, got our president. And interestingly, Robert Smith in 1996, sociologist out at University of San Francisco, wrote a book called We Have No Leaders, which basically argued that the same thing has happened at state and local levels with regards to electoral politics, that we were content to celebrate the first Black mayor, the first Black lieutenant governor, the first Black congressman. We celebrated all these people in office, not recognizing that the power still resided in a few, and that we had to push even those who looked like us to be responsive to the needs of the broad base of people and those who did not have a voice. Just because we had someone who looked like us in office didn't mean that the people that she or he represented had a voice, because we celebrate the election and then lose sight of the accountability. And so what that does is that creates a vacuum into which, though that elite group that Dr. Smith talks about, to further spread their influence, and virtually nullify the already marginalized voice of Black politicians. So recognizing where the core of this nation in terms of control resides is critical for any move towards any meaningful social change. And that requires mobilizing numbers of people who are willing to take on that power center in order to bring about any form of change.
Yeah, that reminds me, Dr. Trulier, at 35 years old, I remember probably being a junior or senior at Howard University, 2007, 2008. And what kept me from the unleavened bread of America was understanding that this is more of a republic than a true democracy. And that was the initial step that allowed me to start playing offense, as opposed to just sitting around taking Dr. Carr, taking the rest of the classes at Howard, and just discussing the problem. To understand that this is a republic as opposed to a true democracy, in which the popular vote should be counted. I mean, after every election, they show the map of where the majority of the votes come from. And you look at the farms in the Midwest and you just say, how is this system set up like this? And questions are raised every time. We have to change this. The majority of the people live in concentrated cities. It was understanding that kept me from the unleavened bread. I'll say, you know, the soul of America comes with a trap. And it has been my quest to help people my age, younger, older, younger cousins, whoever the case may be, little brothers, little sisters, to recognize the trap, because we have to fight the battles even though the war is already won. And if you're not careful, you can stay home in 2016 and you can become apathetic as the battle needs to be fought. Quite sure all of us have had conversations about reparations at least once, probably, if you have some of my friends, turned into a friendly debate about whether or not it will ever happen, whether or not it should happen. I just find it interesting. I'll make this comment that I'll let Dr. Singleton go. It's funny that the United States may not ever issue reparations. I do not think that'll happen. To study reparations is to study the issue of allocation. And so two things have to come together. There has to be an atonement where a sitting president and a sitting Congress admit the wrong and at one moment atone. Then the issue becomes allocations. And it's funny when you get on the topic of allocations, I'm watching Jeff Bezos' ex-wife issue this money to Black institutions and Black organizations. And I'm saying to myself, is this as close as we'll ever get to reparations? Where a billionaire with a heart, whether it comes by divorce or by lottery or by corporation, whatever the case may be, begins to issue money to Black communities. It was amazing to me to watch schools like Kaplan and smaller HBCUs outside of the Spelmans and the Howards receive funds. Someone was advocating for the entire community as opposed to just a more well-known institution. So the soul of the society will maintain its self-deception, but it's amazing how Zipporahs might rise up and issue a type of reparation out of the blue.
I like the conversation about power, Dr. Smith, and one of the areas that I want to focus on for just a few moments is ideological power by a few elites, by the elite segment of the American population, using mediums to continue to send pejorative messages of Black and brown people, and how this continues to be rehearsed to the point that the persons that are oppressed start to imbibe and believe in the messaging that is being communicated, so that when you start to change the way that power looks, it's denied because this has become normative. This is acceptable to see white men in power. Carter G. Woodson in his book, Miseducation of the Negro, talked about when you try to liberate the mind of Black people and change the structure and the system, that there's a desire to go back to what has been the normative practice. And so part of liberating the soul has also to do with liberating the minds of Black people, to recognize that we have more power, that we have pathways that we can pursue to make change and be the agents of change that we are capable of. Trying to change the minds of white people is not necessarily our battle, because I don't think that white people are ever going to give up an ideology that has worked for them, that has continued to manifest powers and benefits and privilege. And so I think we also have to look at how we are viewing ourselves in light of the pejorative messages that continue to be mediated. My colleague, Dr. Raphael Warnock, when he was running for senator, that was a wonderful sweeping change that we saw in Georgia, where these seats that have been well held so long because of our sister Abrams, we were able to see some sweeping change in it. And so that's the kind of liberation that we need to be able to see, is how we're viewing ourselves in the context of oppressive systems.
So it's interesting from I hear work needing to be done both ways, from those who have power and those who are out of power. And if we're thinking of like the parable that Dr. Trulier shared of who would be the Nathan to speak to those who are in power. But what would the parable be that speaks to those who are out of power, that gets them to start thinking a new way? I mean, so that when I think of people of color, I think of a children's story of the Sneetches, and the Sneetches who have stars, the Sneetches who don't, and that whole piece of helping those who don't have to believe that they can do, that they have power as well. I don't know if I know a good biblical story to use as an illustration, but I'm interested in some conversation around both ways. How do you help both sides, those with power, hear a different message, hear themselves in the story, if we use the David and Bathsheba, hear that the parable really is about them? And how do you speak a word to those without, to hear that it can be changed? So how do we duplicate and get more Stacey Abrams? How do we get more Warnock? What's that work that needs to happen? How do
I want to jump in here and use the spirituals as a context for doing what you just said, how you have the biblical story and how the slave master can view it from one lens, and how our forebearers saw the story as a liberating mode, the Moses story from the Exodus, and how the spirituals were created that gave inspiration and vision, that even if change doesn't happen in their lifetime, they see a God that is working on their behalf to break them out. What a wonderful reservoir of spirituality that we've received from our ancestors, and such rich theology. I remember Dr. Mitchell in his book, Soul of Theology, he really opened my eyes to see in Common Talk how our ancestors were this tremendous theologians that were able to reframe the reality that they saw and see Daniel and the lion's den being liberated, of seeing us crossing the Red Sea and seeing that a promised land is possible. And above my head, I hear music. There must be a God somewhere. The Black church was created as an invisible institution because of the rejection of the message by the elite, and going to the hush harbors and deadening the sound of their worship and praise. Their souls were liberated, even though the messaging was antithetical to their very existence. They still experienced God in remarkable ways and proclaimed a gospel that was liberating to each other.
And I think of two stories when I think about reparations and how communities come together and want to go to that Exodus story, that when they got liberated, they were to go to their neighbors, right? They were to go and receive, it wasn't just help, the kind of help they received to be able to go out and leave Egypt. It was substantial. And so you saw communities coming together to support those who were leaving. You see the same thing in Ezra and Nehemiah. When Cyrus says, okay, you all can go back, but before you go back, you go to your communities. You go to your communities and get it. And yes, the government did pitch in. The government did provide some help there, but it was community-based. It was the people coming together saying that they were going to support those who are out there on the front lines. It was the community doing that work. And right now, what we need, and we see it with Stacey Abrams, and we see it in other places where that kind of activism, that kind of knowledge and being in the community, rallying the community, reminding the community of the power that it has, because that's what's going to get people to change. The The people who get elected, they've already seen the power that the Black vote will bring. Because if they weren't scared of the power, we wouldn't have all of the trouble that they're doing now with voter restriction laws, being enacted in just horrendous kind of ways. So what I would think, if we're looking for some examples, to say that we already have it. We need to mobilize it. We need to energize it. And we need to keep pressing it. Our folks need to be informed. We need to be informed, not just passive recipients of what happens. We need to be more informed about what's going on. And I'm just gonna raise my hand and say that includes me too.
I want to build, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I want to build on what Dr. Smith is saying about going and getting your community, right? Talked about Nehemiah and Ezra. And Dr. Singleton mentioned Daniel. Part of the Daniel narrative that we never talk about is the very first chapter when Nebuchadnezzar, sets these dietary, things up for the best and the brightest, the young leadership of the oppressed community, right? And Daniel refuses to eat the meat and drink the wine. The way the text reads, Daniel makes up his mind, and then Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego follow his lead. So there's obviously some social capital between Daniel and those three that leads them into the same space, that enables them, when Daniel's not around, right? Fiery furnace, to take a stand. But they're led into that space by Daniel's decision. And there's obviously a relational capital that has brought the four of them together, right? That enables them to develop that strength. So where that leads me is that in bringing the community along, we have to develop the social capital, the relational capital that is missing when we tend to identify ourselves as individuals and not as a community, right? So that society has become so stratified that we don't have the kinds of relationships that we had 50, 60, 70 years ago in communities. 60 years ago, on Sunday morning, the pastor didn't have to say, turn to your neighbor and do this, or turn to your neighbor and do that, because you saw your neighbor Saturday at the store and you saw him Friday in the neighborhood. Now we commute in and we have to literally ritualize fellowship, because the next time I see you is going to be next Sunday, right? The modern church joke, guy goes into a grocery store and he sees another guy, says, I think you go to my church, turn around, let me see the back of your head, right? Because that's the extent of the social capital. We've lost the sense of interpersonal relationships that strengthen community, right? And that then can be mobilized as communities bring about change. That's the genius of community organizing, which developed in the 80s and 90s, and many of our larger cities have places, have organizations that are connected with Faith in Action. Faith in New Jersey, you have there, or the IAF movement with Build in Baltimore and Washington Interfaith Network here in DC. All of those social movements mobilize communities by working on building social capital between residents so that they feel connected to other residents. And then out of that comes the power that brings about change. It's 1,500 people going down to City Hall in Los Angeles in 1995 and saying, we want to change in criminal justice. And the DA at the time, Bill Garcetti, says, he's talking to the leaders, he says, I really can't talk to you right now. I got this guy driving around on the freeway in the Bronco, and I gotta fix that. And the pastor turns to Mr. Garcetti and says, would you look out the window, please, when you dismiss us? And he sees 1,500 people outside the Los Angeles District Attorney's office. And all of a sudden he's ready to talk about criminal justice reform. the social capital that binds people together is a prerequisite for mobilizing communities to bring about policy change.
Yeah, I will try to offer synthesis based on what everyone has just said. Dr. Singleton mentioned the spirituals. I mentioned earlier my academic interest is literally the hip hop community and rap music. And Dr. Woodard talked about those without power, those without power. And to me, it's most fascinating, Dr. Woodard, as a kid who literally used to live at Palmer, whose dad was a preacher back when it was Eastern. The first theologians I ever heard were Common, Mos Def, and Talib Kweli. I had never heard Have a Talk with God by Stevie Wonder yet. I had never heard some other things where these Black artists I used to read about in Jet would invoke God and therefore community and what's going on and all those wonderful songs. The hip hop community and very much so referencing Generation X, who's somewhere between 45 and or 44 and 58-ish now, their idea of reparations and social capital and uniting for the front was so rejected. I mean, they took their own path towards the goal, in my humble estimation. I had to think about the word, because not only are we dealing with the soul of America, we're talking about liberation, and liberation for all biblical power structures, in my humble estimation, has to be a championing of the kingdom of God, but also opposing the power. And the only kind of oppressive power is not simply political for biblical terms, but there's oppressive power in all of its various forms in our communities, all across the United States. And these men and women said, we aren't waiting for checks. We aren't waiting for discussions. We aren't planning another march. We will do what's necessary, in particular through entrepreneurship, even the use of drug sales. The most successful rapper of all time is probably Sean Carter. You know him as Jay-Z. And I mean, his first earlier albums, he literally borrows scene clips from Casino and Godfather and Goodfellas and Carlito's Way, these Italian mafia movies. So when you deal with liberation, especially to those who don't have power, you got to be careful about the difference between appropriation and adaptation. The genius of those who stand in need in liberation are to adapt and survive. In particular, social survival. Street survival is quite different because it comes with the level of violence. So we talk about those, Dr. Trulier, needing to unite in social capital, which assumes that there's a mutual value in life. Well, in street life, that's not how it goes. So we've got this tension. And again, I raised the question more so than answer the question, but how do you get those in the streets who Stacey Abrams had to reach, at least some of them, to do what she did in Georgia? I mean, what she did will be a paradigm as soon as they get it in print, because you don't transform Atlanta like that and get those numbers unless you hit some places where T.I. and Ludacris and Outkast and all those kind of guys are from. But appropriation can't possibly be true liberation because you adapt the soul of the very thing that's oppressing you. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to spend too much time on, I'll keep it moving, but the tension between adaptation and appropriation is real to properly move forward. And everything Dr. Singleton, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Trulier just said, from utilizing the spirituals, noting that music must be involved, to recognizing the human capital on a horizontal level to move the ball forward.
You said something really interesting about street life. I'm gonna, and you're the expert on that, right? I know a little bit. You know, part of it is because I spend time in jail. So, you know, and not for civil rights either, for civil wrongs. You know, but thank God for Jesus.
Yeah.
But I want to float a thesis. You talked about shared values in street life, social capital. I want to float the thesis that gang life is evidence of the capacity of the streets to build community. And that what is operative in gangs and in crews is the fundamental relational capacity of the Imago Dei.
Yeah.
That we are created. And this is the Christian talking. Now I jump from sociology to Christianity. Sometimes they don't talk. The Christian in me says we were created to be in relationship. Everything in the Genesis narratives is good until the man is alone. I'm a Trinitarian, so God is a relationship, the internal economy of the Godhead. I'm creating the image of a relational God. So there's something that beats in the heart of the individual on the street that says, I need to connect. Where I think my generation fails is we want to tell you how to connect based on our experience, as opposed to dealing with the fundamental need underneath that is there by creative design. So that when a church says we want more young people, normally what they're saying is we want more kids to do what we did 30 years ago, right? They don't want kids on their own terms. So I think that we can, if we have a theological anthropology that's grounded in relationalism, it is absolutely possible to organize the streets. It takes it takes humility, especially on the part of my generation, right? And it takes coming in, being willing to be vulnerable, as opposed to the kind of top-down stuff that we do with young people all the time. But I think it's possible, and I think gangs are evidence of the capacity to create social capital on the street. So I want to float that.
But I still hear, even as I sort of reflect on what Reverend Thomas is saying, I still hear a sort of ambivalence, even when I think about the streets, that this idea of that our Generation X, that they are making, and I'm trying to shut that off, and it's not going away. The idea that it is sort of layered within that fabric of morality and our ability to try to think about how this generation is even understanding that. It's not even going to look the same, because they've established their own rules of what morality is, right? And that's going to be very, very different from an older generation's ideas of what morality is, particularly because if you're in a Christian context, and we have to admit that most of that generation is really kind of not feeling the church. And then what do we do with that? Because if we're saying that it's community is what's going to help us sort of become liberated, if community is the avenue for the liberation, and yet we still have the ambivalence even in our own communities and even within generations, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer. I'm not saying I have an answer. It just raises more questions for me, in terms of how do we move past that? How do we bring that to a place where it can be empowering so that it can address the power inequities that are already oppressing and marginalizing us, and has been for hundreds of years. So I'm not raising it as an answer. It just still pricks more questions for me, because some of that ambivalence is already in our communities.
And I would wonder if that's not worth pushing a little bit if we're talking this thing of liberation. So can we liberate beyond the community if we don't do some work in the community to create community?
It was fascinating to me to really mold all the words in this theme together. Reparations, liberation, soul of society, never to be confused with culture, and to identify with society beyond cultures and subcultures is a task in and of itself for many without power. What has the society done for me? Fine, they pick up my trash every Tuesday and Friday. I guess they let me go to their rundown, overcrowded schools. But what has this society ever done for me? I reflect on the central idea of reparations, but I wonder all the forms reparations take on to people without power. That yes, it would be wonderful if there was a task force that created a set amount. I was doing some reading on reparations, and then they would track everyone's ancestry back to certain slaves, and that's how you would determine who would receive money, who wouldn't receive money. Someone would be bound to disagree with that approach. You would need Ancestry.com and 23andMe and all of those to accurately do that. But what is a reparation on small scales, large scales, tax returns, child tax credits, daycare credits? Some people without power have possibly come to accept that that's the greatest form of reparation they'll ever receive.
I want to do what Dr. Kenan did before. He kind of brought it all together, what you were hearing from others. And so I've heard some conversation about social capital and street life, and Dr. Smith talked about the power of coming together. And what I want to mention is, in the aftermath of the George Floyd's murder and assassination, we saw the street come together in such a powerful way globally, and not just Black folk and Black Lives Movement matter, but folk had liberated minds and believed that change could happen. And we saw change in this country like we had never seen it before, and swiftly. The Minnesota City Police Council voted to dismantle the city's police department and began police training and dealing with systemic racism and culture, and renegotiating police unions' contract to stop it from blocking necessary changes. We saw governors and mayors all over the country signing packages of reform bill. We saw Congress coming together to pass a federal police reform act. We saw a ban on racial profiling, bans on chokeholds, prosecution of police officers who committed murder, prohibitions to no-knock warrants, disclosure of police records in cases of misconduct. That is the power of street coming together and using social capital with various ethnic groups out there marching and putting themselves in harm's way and willing to go to jail to bring about change, and change happened. And the church was not in the center of it. these folk bypassed the church and mobilized Dr. Smith themselves, and using technology, social media. And so they're doing grassroots work like we have never done before, and they did it effectively. And I'm not sure how much presence the church had in all of this. And so, what we're seeing now, unfortunately, is that the church has lost its sense of connectedness. Dr. Trulier was talking about turn to your neighbor and so forth. We're not the ones that are mobilizing the people to bring about change like we did in the 60s and the 70s. We're in a new paradigm.
So what I hear you saying is they saying they can get it done without the church.
They did it.
They get it done without
they did
the
it.
church.
And there are some that are of the Malcolm X type. They burned that police department down, and while others were saying not to do it. I remember talking with some folk who were in Tulsa, Oklahoma, on the 100-year anniversary, and they went there in Black Panther style with guns and saying, you're not going to shoot me. I'm going to shoot you before you shoot me. And so, the dialogue that's taking place beyond the four walls of the church is getting results their way on their terms, Dr. Trulier.
So, and we probably getting to a point where we're going to have to start thinking about wrapping up. But are you saying there's no role for the church, or are you saying the church needs to think about what the church is wrong?
I'm going back to Dr. Tulier's point, because he said, we want young people to come in and do it like we used to do it. Mm-hmm. And these young people are saying, if you don't let us do it on our terms, we'll find another space to do it. And that's what they're doing. So, getting back to my comments earlier about a liberated mind, how do we connect with the street? Mm-hmm. How do we connect with the hip hop culture? How do we do church in a way where we leverage social capital to get some things done? If we continue to do what we've always done, we're going to shrink.
The quick language I use in wrestling with it, especially in terms of the role of liberation, who's leading the liberation. People are grassroots as opposed to just plucking out the weeds. They did it without the church, but I don't think they did it without Christians. The two, anytime Dr. Trulier does that, I'll quickly pass it to him because he's got something to say.
I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you.
Absolutely. He's feeling you.
No, he can get it up far better than I can. It's fascinating. Again, I'm 35, so I've got friends who march. So I'll say this: Thurman got a hold of me early, and because Howard Thurman got a hold of me early, I've never marched. I've never marched. I've had pricking conversations with people before the march, after the march, why they marched, what the goal of the march, where's God in all of this, where's faith in all of this, but I have never marched. I'll say this, as somebody with a pastoral heart, I know there are some people pursuing the liberation of our people, but they've got other questions too. Mm-hmm. And I could connect with them passionately and strongly and wildly on the issue of liberation. But when they text me about another topic, when they DM me, email me about another life topic, I don't believe in suspending liberation, but there's another kind of liberation going on. And I think the beauty of the Black church is that we've never divided it all. I believe that we've seen it, the best of it. The best of the Black church has seen liberation as one process under God.
My excitement was just over your statement, Dr. Thomas, that they did it without the Black church, but they didn't do it without
Christians.
Christians. And I'm just going to lift up two names, one historical, one contemporary. The contemporary name is Tracy Blackman, who was instrumental in what happened in Ferguson. And the historic name is Kelly Millard Smith Sr., the late pastor of First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill in Nashville, Tennessee. Both of them, as Black church pastors, were instrumental to empowering the next generation of leadership. And when we think of Nashville, we think of James Bevells, we think of Diane Nash, right, back in the 60s. Kelly Millard Smith operated behind the scenes as their pastor. He didn't have to be up front. He shepherded them. He consoled them when they were bruised, right? When they faced the opposition on the front line, they knew they could come to First Baptist Capitol Hill and receive care. Tracy Blackman, very similar situation in Ferguson. In fact, we had her at Howard 2 weeks ago to talk about how she got started in social justice. And the answer was that she was a pastor in Ferguson who had opened the doors of her church to funerals, free funerals, right? Not like churches I used to pastor where, if you weren't a member, you had to pay $500 to have a funeral, right? So her thing was free funerals, right? And people from the community that were not members of the church would come, have funerals. This one woman came to one of those free funerals, right? And she took Reverend Blackman's card. And about a year later, she never heard from her again. A year later, Reverend Blackman said she got a call from this woman who said that her son's play Big Brother was lying in the middle of the street. And her son was her 7-year-old son was terrified because they killed Mikey. And I need my pastor, and you're my pastor. Because she came to this free funeral for the community, right? So she didn't show up to lead a movement in Ferguson. She showed up to pastor a distraught woman in public housing whose 7-year-old was crying because Mike Brown was lying in the street.
Wow.
And so the way she put it, she said, God doesn't call us to the front line. She said, God calls us to be with God's people so that we'll be ready when the front line comes to us. And so I can say that the institutional church has lost its way, and I believe that with regards to this next generation. I do believe that those of us who connect with people in that next generation, that's what you're doing, Pastor Thomas, just in your research, and Dr. Smith, that's what you're doing. And, I know Montclair, Pastor Singleton, I've had family there since 1920, right? When you all are connecting, right, you're putting yourselves in positions where when the front line comes, you're already there. And so it's not about what I've seen in Black Lives Matters and in other grassroots movements. It's not that the church has been out front, it's that there are Christians who have been in the mix so that when the front line showed up, they were all present and accounted for. And they didn't have to lead because they already had the social capital of being in space. They didn't show up to lead, they showed up to be, and then emerged as leaders.
Powerful.
It's powerful.
Can I just say one thing before we wrap up?
Yeah, and I was just going to ask if everybody had one more thing they want to say as we wrap up.
Oh,
right
beautiful.
ahead.
So this conversation is about the liberation of the soul of America. And if we didn't think this soul needed liberation, what we have seen during this pandemic is how much of toxicity in our soul, it's risen to the top. We've seen it, and I've talked with pastors, some of the things that are happening in their churches, stuff is rising. The unhealthiness of what's going on with us individually and collectively. And let's just talk about for a few seconds what we've seen in COVID-19. We've seen assaults against Asian Americans who are viewed as the source and carriers of virus. We've seen Black Americans disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 respects to deaths and hospitalization. We've seen gender violence increase. We saw citywide programs that provided safety nets for economically disadvantaged communities. They were cut. We saw people in small businesses unable to pay their rent and face evictions. And when the government gave out money, we saw $1 million corporations getting it, while others that really needed it didn't. We saw people of color forcefully taken down for not wearing masks and social distancing themselves. And we saw with the Payment Protection Plan and CARES Act, how folk were cut out. We saw the horrific deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rashad Brooks, Daniel Pride, and others by police have provoked worldwide outrage. And we've seen unequal access to healthcare and employment and housing and social services. And, we've seen Black men and women assaulted and their lives being snuffed out in some outrageous ways with immunity. And so we see how sick we are as a country and how much in need we are for deliverance. Now, I know I talked a little bit about the church and how it was outside of this movement, but I want to leave on a positive note. The church has the power. We've got the gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The issue is that there are ideas that separate us, and the idea of inferiority and superiority is that ideal, but the gospel seeks to unite us and to remove those ideas that separate us. So we still got the power, and we just have to believe it, and we've got to exercise and leverage the power in a way that brings about change and results. And I believe in the church. I believe we can do it, and we have the social capital to be able to mobilize the masses, just as we did in the 50s and 60s. We still have it. We've just got to be willing to change the paradigm in the way in which we do the work.
And I want to say I'm hopeful too. I mean, what the pandemic has shown the church is that we had gotten comfortable being in our buildings, being in our enclosed spaces, being, sort of cliquish and all that. We got real comfortable with that, but the pandemic forced us to think about how we do church in a different way. We have to go out and be outside of our church to be able to be in the community, to be able to serve the community. And so I am hopeful. I don't know what liberation of the soul of societies is going to look like come 2022. I don't know what that's going to look like, but I am hopeful that the church will still stand. The church has stood for thousands of years, and I'm just confident that the God we serve is still in the business of being in the midst of God's people. And it's God's people who are still going out, and even in a pandemic, going out serving in their communities. And that's hopeful for me. That's where I see hope.
I'm reading Barbara Holmes' book, Crisis Contemplation. And in that book, she talks about the pandemic as exposing a crisis in compassion in America, that we had lost our capacity to be a compassionate people, and that the pandemic exposed it. And she has suggestions on how to recapture that. And I won't go into that. Hope, though, is in listening to people like my esteemed colleagues, like Dr. Single, Dr. Smith, and Dr. Thomas, and leaders like Dr. Glover and Dr. Woodard, because you all let me know, and I think you let others know that God is still on the throne. Just being, just showing up, right? And thinking and praying through issues like this is a sign of hope. So I'm privileged to have been with you all, and I've picked up a lot from this. I want to thank you all for the invitation. Thank you for what you all shared today.
Thank you.
Thank you all as well. I'm encouraged by this conversation. It has been very encouraging.
Amen. And Reverend Thomas, I don't know if we'd let you.
Yeah,
have a word.
I'll make it very brief. It's been an absolute full belly blessing to be here, as they say. I guess my final comments are, with the gospel leading the way, as opposed to the church leading the way,
Mm-hmm.
with
That's
more
good.
battles to fight, even though the war is already won.
Mm.
The genius of Jesus Christ is to keep us from the unleavened bread of the Pharisees. And that must be a part of the liberation strategy. Not to let that influence, that thing he kept pointing to the disciples. Don't do that. Watch out for that. Don't become that. Don't follow them, because you'll both end up in a ditch. There are some of us who have to understand that we must be liberated from the unleavened bread of the soul of this society.
That's a good word.
That's a good word.
Yeah.
I am so grateful to have been able to hang out with each of you, with Dr. Smith and Dr. Singleton, Dr. Trulier, and just gonna claim, and Dr. Thomas, we're just gonna give it to you. You have surely been profound.
As only God can do it.
And we are grateful to Dr. Glover for providing this forum. And we pray that those of you who are listening on today will continue to think about the liberating the soul of society, for there is much work that's yet to be done.